Hello, everyone. Welcome to a special edition of Brown Bag History for Chinese New Year and our Lunar New Year. And Gong Hai Fat Choi. We'll start out by acknowledging the land, traditions, and culture of four nations: the Secwepemc, the Ktunaxa, the Sinixt, and the Okanagan Nation Alliance. We acknowledge our use and inhabitation of this land, sacred to these four nations. The first Chinese people in this region came for the same reason as thousands of others, to seek the gold that could be found in the creeks and tributaries flowing into the Columbia River. In 1865, a gold rush in the Big Bend area of the Columbia River north of Revelstoke brought a flood of miners. The Caucasian miners would not allow the Chinese to work the claims while they were there, but once most of them left the area looking for richer pickings, many Chinese miners moved in. And by the 1870s, it was noted that of the people there still in the region, there was a handful of white miners and several Chinese miners. Somebody who still has active claims in the Big Bend recently donated some Chinese artifacts that were found in the French Creek area north of quite a bit north of Revelstoke. They included a brass coin and several small bottles, some with Chinese characters on them. Many of Revelstoke's early Chinese settlers came here seeking employment after the work on railway construction was completed. In 1880, Andrew Onderdonk secured the contracts for the CPR line between Emery Creek near Yale and Savinaz Ferry near Kamloops. Onderdonk knew that he would require Chinese laborers to add to the available workforce, and he also knew that he could save money on his contracts because of the lower wages paid to the Chinese. Some BC and Victoria politicians objected to the use of Chinese labor, but Prime Minister Sir John A. Macdonald defended Onderdonk's decision. It is simply a question of alternatives. Either you must have this labor or you cannot have the railway. There were up to 15,000 Chinese men employed along the railway line between Port Moody and Craigellachie between 1880 and 1885. Exact figures are impossible to find, as the workers were hired as gangs rather than as individuals, and there was a high turnover of workers. They were engaged in clearing the road, laying ties, and other construction work. The work was tedious, difficult, and dangerous, and the rewards were few. Many of the workers died as a result of workplace accidents or disease, including scurvy. But none of these deaths were registered, so the numbers of deaths are impossible to determine accurately, but it could easily have been in the hundreds or even higher. In 1885, as railway construction was being completed, a royal commission on Chinese immigration was undertaken, and as a result, a head tax was implemented by the Dominion government for all Chinese immigrants wishing to enter Canada. You can actually find this Royal Commission online. It's about 700 pages long, but it makes really interesting and disturbing reading. But you can really see the prejudices against Chinese people at the time. And one thing you'll also note is that they really didn't talk to Chinese people. There was one consul general, I think based in San Francisco, that they talked to. But other than that, they were really talking to the business owners in Victoria and politicians in Victoria. But as a result of that commission, the head tax was implemented for all Chinese immigrants wishing to enter Canada. The tax was levied at $50 in 1885, was increased to $100 in 1900, and to $500 in 1903. The head tax was only levied on people from China, and was a deliberate attempt to restrict Chinese immigration to Canada. In 1923, the Chinese Exclusion Act completely stopped Chinese immigration, and this was not eased until 1947. During that time, fewer than 50 Chinese people were admitted to Canada. In 2006, the federal government issued a formal apology for the head tax and created a program of redress. Finding information on the early Chinese community is a challenge. The newspaper reports were spotty and often derogatory. Local tax records showed the extent of property ownership in Revelstoke and were valuable records. The Canadian Census records were also useful. The Vital Events Index on the BC Archives website helped to find death records, but very few obituaries were printed in the newspaper. In some cases, a death would be reported, but without giving any information on the person. This was the case with the snowslide that demolished the Rogers Pass railway station in January of 1899, killing 7 people. The account listed the names of all of the people and gave some information on them, with the exception of one man who was listed only as a Chinaman cook. The Vital Events Register tells us that his name was either Aham or Ahu, and that he was 42 years old. There's actually 2 records under his name with different names. When Revelstoke was first settled in 1885, Chinese people were among the first residents. There were 133 Chinese residents listed in the 1891 census, comprising between 6 to 10% of the population. And also in 1901 and 1911, there in those years as well, there were over 100 Chinese residents living in Revelstoke. That remained fairly consistent until the 1930s. There were never more than 5 women or 10 children from China listed in the census records for those years. At least half of the men were married, but their wives and children were back in China. Many factors influenced this separation of families, one of which was the head tax. The bachelor society was evident in every Chinatown in the West, and Revelstoke was no exception. In an interview that I did with Jim Kwong in 2008, he spoke of the many elderly Chinese men living in Revelstoke when he was growing up, and talked of how his family looked after them and invited them for the Chinese festival days, especially Lunar New Year and the Moon Festival. He said that the men treated them very kindly and that his family became surrogate children for them. Revelstoke was unique because it had 2 distinct Chinese districts, reflecting the 2 sections of Revelstoke that developed because of the Farwell dispute and the original downtown on Front Street and the town site that sprung up around the station where our downtown is now. There were several Chinese business owners who had businesses on Front Street, especially in the blocks between Benson and Hanson Street. And in this photograph, there's one building with the sign that says Singh Laundry. With the development of the business district near the CPR station, a second Chinatown grew up on the south side of First Street between Orton and MacArthur Avenues. It's really in the area across from the city parking lot, which used to be the site of the YMCA building, and in the area where the bowling alley and Rumpus Brewery are. By 1941, only one Chinese building remained on Front Street, the home and laundry of Singh, who lived in Revelstoke from about 1902 until his death in 1955. There were other Chinese homes and businesses outside of the Chinatowns, notably the Kwong Li Laundry on 5th Street West and the Maryuli Laundry on 4th Street West, and restaurants in the first block of Mackenzie Avenue. In 1909, I found a newspaper account about the people protesting the fact that a Chinese business owner wanted to open a restaurant on Mackenzie Avenue in the first block, be around where the Chubby Funster's restaurant is now. And it was the Oyster and Chop House. And a lot of people were objecting to it, saying that the powers that be shouldn't allow a Chinese building in one of the main blocks of Revelstoke's downtown. But it was there, and it was there for many years. Up until the summer of 1899, there were also several Chinese buildings just north of the city, but these were burned down by city authorities, citing public health bylaws. The photograph that we're looking at on the screen right now is the Kwong family outside of their laundry and home on 5th Street West. And it's the site of the senior center now. Prior to the 1930s and even later, Chinese people were not hired for certain jobs. They could not belong to professions such as medicine, law, or teaching. They were not hired as engineers, firemen, or conductors on the trains. Chinese people found jobs as cooks in hotels and in private homes. This picture shows Mrs. Molson, who her husband was the manager of the Molson's Bank. And they also had jobs as laborers on railway crews and sawmills, as miners, as gardeners, or at other menial work. As was the case during railway construction, Chinese workers were paid less than other workers. Many Chinese people went into business as storekeepers, laundry owners, restaurateurs, tailors, and market gardeners. In 1911, the Chinese residents in Revelstoke worked in the following jobs, according to the census: 50 as cooks in private homes, hotels, and restaurants, 50 as general laborers, mostly on the railway, 23 in laundries as owners or workers, 15 in stores as store owners or salesmen, 2 as domestics in private homes, 4 as tailors, 7 as gardeners or farmers, 8 as dishwashers in hotels and restaurants, 4 as hotel cleaning staff and porters, and 1 restaurant owner. The local newspapers were full of racist slurs, and these attitudes made it difficult for Chinese residents to fully participate in the life of the community. The Kootenai Mail of September 30th, 1899, reported on the burning of a dozen shacks in what is probably now Columbia Park, after the medical health officer, Dr. Cross, ordered their destruction. The article concluded, "It seems that the only way these people can be got rid of is through the sanitary laws, and by keeping a very close watch on them, it is believed that many of them can be driven from the town. Still, it is the white residents of Revelstoke who keep them here. They do this by purchasing fruits, berries, vegetables, etc. from them and employing them in every way possible." So it really gives you a sense of the racism that the Chinese population was up against. In 1900, Alex McRae was running as an MLA for the Revelstoke riding of West Kootenai. And in his platform, he said, "Regarding Asiatic immigration, I am in uncompromising opposition to it and will assist in every legitimate way to stem its tide and discourage its competition with white labor." Several businesses, particularly laundries and restaurants, advertised that they hired white help only. In 1919, a provincial law was enacted forbidding Chinese restaurants from employing white women or girls on their premises. 2 men, Wong Lo and Wong Singh, proprietors of the Windsor Hotel Cafe, were charged under this act and fined $5 each. This photograph that we're looking at is the interior of the Oyster and Chop House restaurant on Mackenzie Avenue in probably 1918. It was during the war because the notice on the wall talks about the restrictions during the war years. But you can see that there are 2 white women employed by them. So under this new law, they would have lost their jobs. And that law was really enacted because there was concern amongst the white lawmakers that if women were working with Chinese men, it could encourage them to white women to want to marry Chinese men. And it was really to stop that mixed marriages or fraternization of the races. So very, very racist policy again. There were also around that time new gambling laws and opium laws that really targeted the Chinese population. In February 1920, police raided a house on 1st Street East and arrested 21 Chinese men for playing fan tan. And they were uh, all given fines for that. In 1921, there were several Chinese men arrested for smoking opium. And in one case, were 4 men fined $200 each, or if they couldn't pay the fine, they were given 6 months hard labor in Ocala prison just for smoking opium. And, the newspapers, since they didn't really reflect the realities of the lives of the Chinese people, and we can find all of the people, Chinese people who were here and who died in Revelstoke between 1885 and 1955. But of those deaths, only 33 were recorded in the newspaper, often when the death was the result of an accident. In the notes I have here, there's one person who's not named who was found dead and probably hit by a train, and another man who was just referred to as Too Bitty. But I was able to find records for him, and he was most likely Get Chung, who died in 1926 at the age of 70. The Chinese culture was also seen in the local press as foreign and exotic and mysterious. Although they weren't always treated with respect, there was an element of wonderment at their customs. In November of 1901, the Chinese community built a temple as a worship place of the Chinese folk religion, Shinhism. It was known in the local community as the Joss House, although that term is considered derogatory. The Chinese Herald of November 20th, 1901 described the new building. The Chinese celebrated the opening of the new Joss House on Front Street on Sunday with a vast expenditure of firecrackers outside and prayer sticks inside the building. The temple was visited by considerable numbers of people on Sunday, being open to the inspection of the curious. Tables in front of the picture of Ji Hing, the tutelary divinity of the shrine, were spread with a lavish display of Chinese confectionery and preserved fruits, in the midst of which the joss sticks smoldered with their faint incense-like fragrance. A large hanging lamp, round which paper figures revolved continually by the familiar device of a current of air, attracted a good deal of attention. On the balcony outside were stacks of ceremonial banners, halberds, etc., of curious design and considerable value. Altogether, there was much worthy of observation by the white visitors to the Joss House. The local citizens were fascinated with Chinese burial practices, and the funeral of Mark Singh, age 56, was recounted in great detail in the January 1897 issue of the Kootenai Mail. And the photographs you're going to see were from the collection of the Dickey family. And we believe that they are describing this particular funeral. It just matches up in terms of the snow on the ground and the numbers of people and the descriptions. The Kootenai Mail said, one of the strangest and most interesting ceremonies ever witnessed anywhere was the Chinese Masonic funeral of Mark Singh at Revelstoke on Tuesday. The deceased was a distinguished Mason, had been wealthy once, but died poor. The funeral rites began with a large gathering of Chinamen, arrayed in most extravagant and fantastic costumes. Some were in white, some in black, others again in purple, but the many were in red and yellow vests, with a disc inscribed with characters back and front. At about 2:30, the funeral procession formed up, and headed by a rider on horseback with a riderless horse led next, representing the empty place of the leader, and with 3 bands at various intervals, a move was made for the cemetery. It presented a brilliant and unique spectacle, and one that will not readily be forgotten by the spectators. 4 men in long black hats and black robes represented, with others carrying guns, a guard of honor, and 2 in purple bearing lanterns were as aides to light the deceased over the dark river. The great majority, those attired in colored vests and carrying many shaped flags and grotesque figures and emblems, represented soldiers, and a semi-military idea pervaded the entire proceedings, being carried out in conformity with the Chinese Masonic ritual. And the newspaper went on to say, it was a most extravagant and brilliant affair throughout, and must have cost a great deal of money. As nearly as could be counted, 80 took part in the funeral. Despite the barriers that Chinese families faced in Canada, many of them thrived and became proud and productive citizens. The Kwong family of Revelstoke exemplifies this pioneer spirit. Wong Kwong came to Canada in 1899 and obtained work in Revelstoke as a labor contractor for the Canadian Pacific Railway. Wong was well educated and was fluent in both Cantonese and English, making him ideal to recruit Chinese laborers. He established a store and rooming house on First Street East to provide for the needs of his laborers. And they had an office for their laundry as well that was located on Fifth Street. In 1907, Wong Kwong brought his wife, Yvonne, from China. Yvonne's feet had been bound as a child, making it difficult for her to walk. The family built a house on Fifth Street East, where the senior center is now, and established the Kwong Lee Laundry. Mr. and Mrs. Kwong had 10 children, 6 girls and 4 boys, but one girl, Maisie, passed away in 1925 at the age of 6. Wong Kwong died in 1932 at the age of 57, leaving his wife and 9 children, ranging in age from 5 to 22 years. The youngest in the photograph here was Jim, who just passed away this year. Last year. It was the middle of the Great Depression, and Mrs. Kwong faced a struggle to raise her large family, relying on the family laundry to see them through. In the words of youngest son, Jim, Mother, through her strength, courage, and loving discipline, organized a family work unit that not only enabled the members to survive, but to go on to higher education and to become meaningful citizens. Incidentally, she was also able to pay off all of Father's debts with interest. In her later years, Mrs. Kwong moved to Vancouver, where she passed away at the age of 95 in 1973. In this photograph I'll show again, it shows the Kwong family and the extended family members outside their laundry and home on Fifth Street. The man in the white shirt and tie is Wong Kwong, and the woman in black seated is Mrs. Kwong. The 2 children next to her are their oldest children, Sam and Jean, and the others are related family members, but we don't know all of their names. Jean, who's sitting in the high chair, was the oldest daughter in the family, and she went on to study nursing at Royal Columbian Hospital in New Westminster, and she became the first nurse of Chinese descent to graduate as a nurse in Canada, and really broke a barrier by doing that, and went on to have a career as a nurse. And at least 2 of her sisters also were nurses as well and had good careers in that field. The youngest sister, Mary, told me that when Jean graduated, she was the top student, but the school didn't give her this prize for top student. It went to the next person who was not Chinese. So, even in the midst of a real incredible achievement, there was still that racism that was shown, but really a remarkable family. One of the sons, John Kwong, and his wife, Mary, purchased Manning's candy store and turned it into a Chinese restaurant in 1955. And it's still a Chinese restaurant now. And then they also purchased the building where WK Garden restaurant is now and ran it as the Chalet restaurant. And here's Mary inside the chalet. When the first time I came to Revelstoke was in 1977, when I was engaged to Ken, and I came here to meet his parents. And they took us out for dinner at the Chalet restaurant. So that was my first restaurant in Revelstoke. It was very good, I must say. One of the other prominent businessmen in Revelstoke in the early 1900s was Chung. He was born in China in 1859 and came to Canada in 1882 and working on railway construction. In 1890, he was working at Glacier House. Then in September of that year, came to Revelstoke and opened what was referred to in the Kootenai Mail as a first-class Chinese store. Before long, he owned several properties on Front Street and Douglas Street, and also on First Street East. He owned the Oyster and Chop House restaurant on Mackenzie Avenue, and his son Bing, also known as Charlie, continued to operate it until the 1940s. Chung also leased the Crowell Ranch, where the airport is located now, and grew vegetables for sale. An obituary in the Revelstoke Review in August 1929 had the death of his wife, but her first name was not given either in the paper or even in the Vital Events Registry, where she was listed as Chung Hua. Her obituary stated that she'd been married for 50 years and had been in Revelstoke since 1912, a period of 17 years. At that time, their residence was on First Street East. Chung died in Revelstoke on July 6, 1932, at the age of 74. At the time of his death, his obituary stated that he had one son living in Revelstoke and another in Chicago. Another prominent Chinese resident was Chung. He was born in China in 1863 near Canton and came to Canada at the age of 16 to work on railway construction. His obituary claimed that he was present at the driving of the last spike, and that was probably true, but he certainly didn't make it into the famous photo, and neither did any of the hundreds of other Chinese laborers. By the 1890s, Chung was operating a store on Front Street, and it became one of the leading Chinese stores in Revelstoke. He later moved his business to First Street East, in the block across from what is now the city parking lot. Chung also had a ranch in Columbia Park, where he grew strawberries, many of which were sent to Alberta for sale. Chung had multiple wives, and he had 6 sons, all born in Revelstoke. His obituary also claimed that he had a wife and daughter in China. We have an oral history in the museum by Doris Siegfried Smith, who was brought up on Front Street and born there in the early 1900s. And she talked about Chung's family and the fascination they held for a young girl. She said the Chinese had their little homes. They were one right onto the other. The head one, Mr. Chung, had a store, candies and bread and so on. He lived at the back, and I think there were 3 wives that I can recall. And the first wife died. This was in January, I think it was. It was bitterly cold, but they didn't seem to mind. They just had their little satin hats on and their very long, heavily embroidered coats. They didn't have a hearse. They had a big sleigh and her big bed with a canopy, and all was on this sleigh. And she lay on this bed covered with all these magnificent satin blankets. It was a magnificent sight to see. And then Doris Siegfried Smith also recounted going to see a new baby at the Chung house. She said, well, my friend over here, Ethel Abrahamson, said, we should go down and see the baby. My mother always said to me, you're not going back to those quarters. I wouldn't like it. But we went down this day to get 5 cents of candy, and Mr. Chung came out and he said, do come in and see our new baby. So of course we couldn't resist. And we went in, and the wee little thing was dressed just like the grown-up Chinese. It had a wee little satin hat on and a pale blue embroidered kimono. And it looked so unnatural to see this baby dressed just like it's grown-ups, you know. One of the wives of Chung died on December 18th, 1910, at the age of 45. That could have been the funeral that Doris Smith was talking about. And his wife, Zheng Ling, died on a trip home from China in 1921. The article in the January 20th, 1921 edition of the Revelstoke Review describes that. Mrs. Chung buried in China. Information received in the city this week of the death from asthma of Mrs. Chung, a well-known and highly respected resident of Revelstoke for the past 15 years, in the 35th year of her age. Some months ago, deceased left to spend a holiday trip at her old home in China, and last month left to return to Canada. She was not apparently in the best of health when she left, and 2 days out from Hong Kong, she passed away. On the arrival of the boat at Shanghai, her body was shipped back to Hong Kong for burial. Mr. Wing Chung continued the homeward trip after the funeral, arriving in Vancouver about a week ago on the Empress of Russia. He will remain in the coast city for about a week, expecting to reach Revelstoke next Thursday. The oldest son of Wing Chung, Sam Jack Hung, died in Kamloops in 1932 at the age of 24. He had attended school in Revelstoke, then spent some time in China to further his education. At the time of his death, he was working as a secretary and interpreter at the Chinese Masonic Temple in Kamloops. Another son, Sam Lai Mi, was the first Chinese Canadian to join the BC Dragoons and was a chief cooking instructor during World War II. Upon his return, he became a well-known and award-winning chef in Vancouver. And I met Sam Lai Mi. He came to the museum in the 1980s and was able to talk to him about the family history. And Wing Chung sold his Revelstoke property in the early 1940s and moved to Vancouver, where he died in 1955 at the age of 90. Here he is with some of his grandchildren, I think all of whom I have met over the years. Yeah, really notable local resident was Charlie Singh, who's we're not sure of his real name. I've seen it as Lo Wai Jing, but I've also seen other versions of his name as well. But he was known locally as Charlie Singh. He owned a market garden in what is now the industrial park, about where the BC Hydro office is. And he supplied the local residents with fresh vegetables, driving his cart through town to make his deliveries. He usually had candy in his pockets for the children he would meet along the route. But I've also heard stories that he also kept a beetroot handy to rub into the cheeks of children that he caught stealing from him so that their mothers would know what they'd been up to. He was known for his many acts of kindness, such as giving silk handkerchiefs and lily bulbs to his customers at Christmas, and leaving vegetables at the homes of people who were experiencing sickness or death in the family or hard times. When he died in October of 1954, his funeral was said to be one of the largest in Revelstoke up to that time. He is buried in the Mountain View Cemetery in Revelstoke with a marker inscribed with the message, "God bless him." Mar Yuli came to Canada from Guangdong Province, China, probably around 1900. In 1912, he brought his two sons, Jock and Phi. Jock was 12 years old and Phi was a few years older at the time. Jock attended high school in Revelstoke and was known as a talented wrestler and basketball player. The Mar Yuli Laundry was located on 4th Street East, next to where the fire hall is now. You can see the Mar Yuli Laundry sign. This is a little bit blurry because I it's cropped it from a larger photograph of the area. And Jock became proficient in English and served as a court interpreter in the Okanagan and the Kootenays in Alberta. In 1927, Marjock moved to Kelowna, where he operated the Star Cafe on Water Street. In 1929, he and his brother Phi opened the Golden Pheasant Cafe on the southwest corner of Bernard Avenue and Ellis Street. It was a downtown fixture for many years. During the Depression, Marjock would open up a soup kitchen from the back door after the restaurant closed for the day. During the Second World War, he joined the BC Dragoons militia and obtained the rank of sergeant. After he closed the Golden Pheasant restaurant in 1969, he retired to his orchard property in West Kelowna, where he was known for his asparagus patch, 23 acres, and for raising bees, chickens, and geese. Marjock died in 1983, and the recently opened school in West Kelowna was named the Marjock Elementary School in his honor. This is the original WK Cafe at the current site of Kawakubo Restaurant, It was later owned by another person under the name of Henry Restaurant. The WK was relocated and is still there, and the Hong Kong restaurant is in operation. And we also have New Manning's Chinese restaurant in town, and Kevin's Kitchen, which opened 6 years ago. And every year for Lunar New Year, I give Kevin and Lucy a crocheted zodiac animal. And this year was the year of the ox. So they have their ox to celebrate this year. So I wish everybody a very happy Lunar New Year. Thank you for joining us. I will be doing another Brown Bag History next Wednesday, February 17th at noon. And hopefully I've got my technical side figured out, and it will be both on Zoom and on Facebook Live. It will be on Revelstoke's public heritage buildings. The other thing I wanted to tell you is that for Family Day, we are running a little photo challenge. We've just posted 6 photographs on our Facebook page, and we encourage you to look at them and see if you want to recreate one or more of them, and send us the results. And there will be prizes for that. So thank you again for joining us, and we'll see you again next week.